A very warm welcome, everybody, to our second departmental seminar in Lentern. As you can see, the social policy meeting room is back in business. So here there is a small crowd there. So you can return if you're online and wish to attend in person. Please do so in future weeks, and sweet and savory snacks might be provided to provide you with a bit of an incentive structure. So here, back in business web room. Today we have Yifei presenting. Most of you do know Yifei, but still a brief introduction is in order. Yifei joined the department as an LSE fellow in 2019. In her research, she very much focuses on public administration and public management, and here with a particular focus on education policy and governance. Her research focuses primarily on China and India, but on this occasion, she actually presents a paper to us focusing on Brazil. If you're ready, please do share your screen with us, and the floor is yours.
And well, first of all, just well, both a warm welcome, and also thank you so much for those of you either joining in the web room over there or like joining online. So as you can see on the screen, just started the slow showing mode. Yeah, so it's a research about policy capacity and also how it matters for education reforms, in which we have contrasting cases from two states within Brazil. So to begin with, maybe just to show a broader context of this study in terms of what we know about education reforms already, or like maybe or what we don't know yet. So I think the first message, if we look at the education reforms and in terms of its outcomes in the global south, we can see that there are several syntheses of evidence or literature reviews saying that the results over there is actually highly mixed, in which there's both success cases, but also like many failure cases as well. So in thinking about how to improve the education reform performance in the global south, so one literature that is emerging in the education policy is mainly the lessons are from the developed countries. So one literature about that labels those countries as high performing education systems, right? HPES. So examples of those include, say, Singapore, Finland, etc. But the problem, while it has already been very good insights generated from there, but one potential problem is that if it is the high level of socioeconomic development, or by extension, the resources of those systems that has led to a better performing outcomes, then the lessons or the extent to which the developing country systems can learn from that would be actually highly limited. And lastly, the last observation here is that most existing account of what works within those high-performing systems focuses more on what a system has, like namely the resources that they have, or like what it believes in terms of the social norms underpinning the system, or like the role of values as that. But relatively speaking, what the system does and how it gets work done, which are identified by some, especially the policy design literature authors, as the key underpinning for the design and implementation of education reforms. So these are the relatively underexplored within this literature. So in that overarching context here, so what we wish to do within this research is, well, we developed a policy capacity explanation of the education reform outcomes. And then using that framework, so we applied that to a within country comparative setting. So the two states that we are comparing here, and we will get more in details in the methodology part. So one state is called Ceará, and the other is, let me try my best, Rio Grande do Norte. But instead of like embarrassing myself further with my poor Portuguese, so one state we can refer it to as CE, and the other is RN, and we will see what explains the difference of education outcomes in these two otherwise similar states, and also both of them marked by limited resources. So in addressing this main research question here, we wish to make, well, so some both the theoretical and also empirical and practical contributions. So theoretically, as we will see later, so this is designed as a most similar case study. So in that case, it adds to the policy design literature by further demonstrating the explanatory power of the policy capacity framework in understanding education reform outcomes here. So you might notice that in earlier works, I've had another paper that focused on one specific aspect of the education system. So by comparing China and the Chinese and Indian education system at a time, I looked very specifically at a teacher capacity framework development. But this research further expanded the scope by looking at the education reforms in general. And other works have examined, used the framework to comprehensively assess the reform efforts within other social policy sectors, such as healthcare reform, for example. And then another dimension of the empirical contribution is that since it focused on the two states within Brazil, so we also hope to add to the still emergent literature of policy capacity on the Latin American context. And lastly, so compared with drawing lessons from the high-performing systems mentioned earlier, which is mostly located in the, sorry, a typo here, developed world. So the lessons that can be generated from this research could also be more relevant for other developing countries to contemplate and adapt. And next, when it comes to the theoretical framework part, so the first of all, what we adopted as the definition of what we mean by education reform is here from this book chapter, which sees it as policy interventions aiming to improve the status of education system, finance, and practice in one or more of the dimensions mentioned here. So on the one hand, it suits our purpose well because this definition is relatively broad, and with this definition we can really see that there are many education reforms going on in the global south over the last few decades. But it should also be noted here that actually not all domains here were pursued in equal ways. So if you look at, say, 3 or 4 decades back or even earlier, the reform efforts is mainly considered with regard to the improving the access, right? And then accordingly, the policy efforts are, well, expanding the infrastructure, investment, more inputs, whereas the more recent decades, building on the, well, first of all, it's the Millennium Development Goals, and nowadays the SDG 4 would focus more on the equity and equality dimension of that. It is within the reform efforts on these dimensions that we see a more mixed record of its effectiveness. So on the one hand, it might suggest that improving equity and equality is really a more complex task as compared with just improving access through the quantitative expansion, right? So the complexity aspect is further highlighted by some other authors. So some authors saying that, mentioned complexity in terms of education reforms, encompassing a full range of contexts and also covering almost the entire range of policy stages, from agenda setting and all the way to policy making, and then through the implementation and evaluation. But other authors also pointed out that education reforms are complex because of the multiple and a variety of stakeholders it involves. And each of them, or at least many of them, would have diverse interests, incentives, and capacity, etc. So all of these complexities highlighted here in turn suggests that there is a need to understand reforms at the system level, and especially in terms of the competencies and the skills a system must possess in order to navigate and steer through such complexities. But despite such a need to understand the reforms at the system level, but if you look at the mainstream literature of studying education policy and education reforms, and especially for those like more recent experimental researches, etc., so you would see that the focus is more on a single form or a single type of reforms, right? So typical examples include, well, decentralization, school-based management reforms, privatization, performance pay, etc. But relatively little is out there that focuses on the, well, like comprehensively what is going on at the system level. So in order to make such an examination, so we would see that the recent literature on policy capacity actually, well, both offers some conceptual clarity in terms of the competencies and the capabilities to navigate through this complexity. And also in the meanwhile, it also picks up some of the other dimensions of the complexities highlighted earlier, such as the education reforms encompassing both the design and also the implementation phases, and also incorporating the multiple stakeholders involved over there. So essentially, our adapted framework looks like this, in which, well, we start, as per the literature, we started by looking at the analytical capacity, which is defined, well, on several dimensions. So first of all, is the commitment to evidence-based policymaking, and is then reflected in education policy sector in particular. It means the ability to track the performance and also diagnose the problems and the gaps within the education system. And so in order to facilitate that, it would also require a comprehensive and relevant data from multiple sources. So as we will see later on in one of the cases, in terms of both the system, state level performance of the entire system, but also like maybe more micro focus in terms of the classroom performance, and also the data used both for summative purposes, but also for just as an input for teacher training and other activities. So that is on the analytical side. And then once you had gained the insights from like stemming from the analytical capacity, operational capacity is required in order to feed these insights into the design and implementation of the appropriate instruments to solve the issues identified. So in thinking about the appropriate instruments here, well, there's different ways of or different typologies over there, but like the most famous one could be like, so the NATO framework, in which Christopher Hood divided them into, say, the instruments regarding the provision and the reception of the information, and then authority-based instruments such as regulation, and then the financial-based instruments, what he calls the treasury, and then the organizational-based ones. So in thinking or in examining those policy instruments here, it is important to also notice that in order for them to succeed, it needs to be adaptive or sensitive towards the targets and also the other kind of contextual realities. And then lastly, the system also needs to have some political capacity, meaning that like the ability to harness the public support or at least mitigate the oppositions towards reform. And in doing so, it might require the government itself to have some willingness to treat education as the policy priority, which could be especially difficult in the developing countries. So one explanation provided by the political economy literature is that compared with other more politically visible tasks, right, such as providing so the freebies, free electricities, and also like in terms of even within the education, right, quantitative expansions. So these tasks are more relatively easier to give credit for, political credit for, right? Whereas improving the quality of education, not only is it less visible, but it also might take a longer time span that is incongruent with the election cycle. So another example of the difficulty to have such kind of willingness is the rampant corruption that is seen in some of the education systems. But having this willingness is not enough. Like in order for the system to be politically capable to supporting the reform, it also needs to align the diverse interests of the multiple stakeholders. So by consulting with them and providing the platform for them to well express their opinions and perceptions as such. So we will see later how this framework helps us to understand the reform experience and outcomes in two of the Brazilian states. So, but before that, let me just briefly introduce the settings of this most similar case design, or in other words, on what front are they similar, and also in what items are they different? So, well, here, as you can see on the left-hand side is a map of CE and RN. So with the green color representing CE and the yellow color representing RN. So in terms of their geographic features, you see that they are along the northeast coastline and being to neighboring states. And actually, both of them are predominantly covered by semi-arid arid land. So this poses challenges in terms of well, getting the regular water supply for productive uses, which is one of the reasons why both states are actually considered socio-economically backward. So you can see that in terms of the Human Development Index, I think, well, we didn't provide the ranking here, but it's overall below the average of, below the Brazilian average. And in terms of the population, and also you can see the size here. So the Ceará is a substantially larger state as compared with RN. But having said that, the number of municipality, I think it's only there are only 17 more new municipalities over there. So in that case, if you think about the pressure felt by on a system in order to provide quality education for all, actually it is more burdensome for the system of CE as compared with RN. So let's take a more look at their similarities in terms of the resource level, both generally and more also more education specific. So, well, in terms of the GDP per capita, the rankings is not only like way below the Brazilian average. So Ceará is actually like even more behind. As you can see, it ranks at the 23rd, whereas RN is actually slightly better as well. And then the other thing that you might think that is relevant for education policy and its effectiveness could be the size of government, right? So we take the proxy here is the, well, both the total number of state public servants, but also the state public servants per 1,000 inhabitants. So, well, overall, expectedly, you can see that the number of public servants in CE is like the number is much higher. But when it comes to the like more on an average basis, it is again RN that has relatively more resource in terms of the civil servants here. And similarly, I think if we look at the student-teacher ratio, right, again, it is RN that has a better ratio here. And lastly, in terms of the annual public expenditure per student, the reason why there's not that much difference within the two states is that a substantial amount of the per student funding comes from the federal level, so which we will come back in a minute as well. But even within that, you can see that, again, it is RN that is ranking higher and investing more money per student within their basic education system. So this kind of establishes their overall similarities. And in case of the nuances that the two states have, it can be said that it is actually RN that has relatively more resources compared with the CE case. And the other interesting thing about these two states is that if you look at the if you wish, the baseline assessment, right, which is the IDAB results of 2005. So some background information here. So IDAB is a composite index that covers or ranks all states in Brazil that consist of not only the test scores, but also like the dropout rate, retention rate, and the progression rate. So it's a synthesis of all these indicators. And within the benchmarking year, or the first time when it is available, the difference between CE and RN, CE although slightly better, but it's not differing that much. And you can see that both are lagging behind the Brazilian average of 3.6. But what is interesting is over time, like over the nearly 2 decades period, their performance further differed to the extent that in 2019, which is the latest data available, CE already performs as one of the best systems, education system in Brazil, even higher than the average, whereas RN, despite its improvement from the previous system, remains lagging behind. And this picture of IDAB results is further corroborated with the literacy rate. Unfortunately, the 2016 is one of the only 2 rounds of national-wide literacy rate assessment. So again, we can see that not only is CE performing much better, and also it's like way above the Brazilian average in terms of the percentage of students having sufficient skills of reading and also writing. And lastly, we can also see some changes of the enrollment patterns in which although both states have seen the decline of the enrollment in government schools, but what we can call the vote by fit phenomenon might be much less, as in the case of CE, which only has 23% of increase in the private school enrollment, as compared with RN, which sees almost double the rate. So after establishing the contextual similarities of the two cases, and also their more or less similar starting point in terms of the education outcomes. So what really happened that can explain their divergent experience over the last 2 decades? So this is what we need to look at their education reform experience, and also see what are the different configurations of policy capacity that is involved in that. So, in other words, we can see that RN is more or less a typical case within the region in which a lower level of resources will continue to result in less than average or less satisfying education reforms, whereas CE is really a deviational case in which it managed to transcend its resource disadvantages. So well, before presenting the results, maybe just a quick word in terms of the data that we used. So first of all, we looked at all the major policy documents at both the federal level as a kind of background input, but also within these 2 states. And it is further supplemented by the administrative data sets that is mainly available at the national level. And lastly, we scanned through not only the literature available in English, but thanks to my co-authors here, we also delved into the Portuguese literature, mainly by the Brazilian authors. So from these two data portals here. And lastly, in order to, both given the relatively scarcity of information availability on the RN side, and also to understand in more detail their reform experience. So we also consulted two experts who are former secretaries of the State Education Commission in RN in a local seminar that back in 2019. So to begin with, just to give an overview here, so this is roughly like by way of timeline, the reform initiatives at both the federal level and within the two states. So, even though it appears that there's quite a few items on the Brazilian federal level, but mostly it's just on the national level assessment. So, for example, the IDAB one that we relied on to see the education outcomes over there. So, the IDAB back in 2019, it's actually building on an earlier initiative called SAEB, which I think at that time focuses entirely on the student test scores rather than being a composite index. Whereas in 1996, there are some financial arrangements, so both the LDB and FundDev in terms of the money or the rules of fiscal transfer from the federal to the state level. And otherwise, there is a constitutional change of removing the age of the school age like by 1 year earlier. And the other thing that is important that is interesting to notice is that if you look at the what is called a PNAC here, starting from 2012, it's actually copying after the successful experience of the PIEC, which is a synthesized effort to improve the literacy within the state. But as you can see here, unlike within CE, that the program has consistently successful over over the next decade. So the national level copycat of this system actually got terminated in 2018. But overall, the message that I want to deliver here is that there are a few national initiatives there, but given the federative nature of the Brazilian political system, and it is still the states that ultimately is the both to operationalize more in detail the national initiatives, but also come up with their own substantive policy reforms and efforts to improve the education outcomes within the state. So, to begin with, even just in terms of the number of initiatives, you can we will see later that there's many more within the case of CE as compared with RN. But we can also see how the different kind of configurations of policy capacity is behind this picture. So, let's begin with the variations of their analytical capacity. So I think, on the dimension of analytical capacity, the first thing that we can notice is that the data infrastructure in CE is both much more comprehensive and also diverse and in a way complementary in terms of the purposes that they are able to fulfill. So, for example, there is this baseline student assessment that is done several decades, 2 decades back, just to define the targets with the municipalities under the PIEC system. And then in addition to that, which is quite a high level or macro level kind of overlook, but on the other hand, there's also those more micro focus on the student or the classroom classroom-specific performance information, which is conducted at the start of the year. And that information is more used towards the classroom level planning, and also to be inputted in the teacher training, in-service training as well. And then lastly, there's also an example of the end year, which is external evaluation in terms of another school level literacy program that is more directly as a monitoring device towards fulfilling the literacy target over there. So compared with the comprehensive structure here, we didn't see any comprehensive arrangement as such that is available in the case of RN. And behind that, it also reflects some kind of attitudinal difference, whereas back in the before 2005, I think there when the Ciala first realizes the kind of educational status within the state, they also see that nearly 50% of their students at a school education level cannot read or write. But instead of treating it as something negative, I think that kind of message was proactively absorbed as a sign of the severity of the issue, which in turn triggered all the reform efforts afterwards. Whereas in RN, so the similarly low level of student learning outcomes is somewhat still treated as presenting a negative picture, rather than seeing it as highlighting the need and also the imperative for change. And lastly, if we think about the reason why CE is able to have such a comprehensive infrastructure behind, is that the experts involved in their design are both multidisciplinary, such as from the economics field, from the education pedagogical or educational studies field, and there are also experts on management side as well, or even for those non-academic experts, those are the expertise that they have is accumulated through a very long time of professional experience, and which can be treated back in as early as 1990s. Whereas in RN, so this is what we got from the former education secretaries, which consistently pointed out that the state lacks a systematic process and a criteria for hiring the qualified staff with knowledge in management. So following up with this picture in terms of the variations on analytical capacity, we've also seen that there are quite a number of variations on operational capacity. So the first thing is there are different treatment towards the solutions to the illiteracy problem, which is a problem in both states. But unlike CE that targeted the problem at the school education level, which is informed by the data that they different kind of data that they generated earlier, whereas RN is more targeting the problem at the adult education level, which is why despite the decrease of enrollment at the school education level, we've actually seen that over the past decades, from 2000 to 2020, there is actually an increase of the enrollment of the adults within the education system. But even though it is to some extent also effective, but it also means that RN has missed an opportunity to really target the issue at the very school level. But more concretely, the difference in operational capacity is also reflected in the different kind of policy instruments that they are using. So in the CE part, we see that again, there is a combination of the different types of policy instruments here. So the example of organizational instrument, you can see that they have this region. So the use of their regional units, even though regional units is a common practice across the states in Brazil, but they involved the regional units as especially a device to support the municipalities to implement the composite reforms on the for the literacy targets. The support would include, say, like very tailored in-service training and also the provision of teaching and learning materials, etc. Whereas in contrast, even though the decentralization or giving more autonomy is emphasized in the context of RN as well, but it mainly considers only the state schools only, without taking into account the municipal managed schools. So this is the difference in terms of the organizational instruments. And then in addition to that, there is like original initiative happening in CE, which is called a Escola Nota 10 here, which is basically an initiative to activate the bottom-up change at the local level. So basically, it solicits the best practice submitted by the local schools or the teachers, and then having an award ceremony, both to recognize those kind of practices, but also to as a way of disseminate it more widely within the system. And then lastly, in terms of a financial policy instrument here, is that what is called ICMS here, which is essentially a tax transfer redesign here. So before the redesign, I think the rule is more focusing what the transfer is based on the number of students each state have. But like by after the redesign within the CE, so they've also especially factored in the educational performance of the municipalities, and also like giving it as having the highest weight as compared with other targets such as environmental, health related as well. So behind this picture of like the variations in both the analytical and operational capacity, so lastly, we've observed some quite a stark difference in terms of both their political commitment and also the way that they engage the different stakeholders here. So we see that in CE, there is a political, so the state reform leaders does have a very strong political commitment here. The reason behind that is that those holding the state level positions, they are voted into office from a turnaround municipality called Sobra, which is also a very rural, backward municipality within the state, but somehow they are able to remarkably improve the education outcomes in that municipality through a series of reforms. So the message sent up by this move is that it boosts both the commitment, but also or reduced what is called the dark incentives, but also created confidence and inspirations for other municipal leaders as well. Whereas the political landscape in RN is that it's marked by high turbulences, which according to the former secretary here, it both like reduced the ability for her to harness a pro-reform coalition, but also like increases the chances that the official positions will be just accommodating for political purposes. And secondly, when we look at the stakeholder interest alignment, so we can see that one very ingenious way of doing that is the tax transfer reform, right? So previously, in operational capacity side, we mentioned that as an financial instruments, but here, what is noticeable about its rules is that the municipal, even though the education target is featured heavily within the weight of the transfer formula. But essentially, once the money is given to the municipality level, it is entirely the municipality's freedom to decide how to use these funds. So you can either use it for education purposes, but you can also like use it for other purposes as well. So this kind of like builds municipal level kind of like consensus towards the pro-education reform, because while it is also in the incentive of the finance department as well as many other departments to also support the education reform. Whereas in the case of RN, so I think the state is like more fundamentally seeing the municipalities as the potential competitors in receiving the fundings from the federal level. And also like some of the more influential stakeholders are also against the notion of the reform. And lastly, we've also seen that whereas CE has absorbed and welcomed the contributions of non-state actors, such as both the international or international organizations or international NGOs or the NGOs more locally, as well as the teachers' unions. Whereas in the RN, so even though there are some externally funded projects, but the contributions from those initiatives was not taken on board in subsequent planning within the state. So just to quickly conclude here, so we see that through this comparison, we see that Sierra's success stems more from its ability to keep track of the system status and progress, and then also uses the innovative and coordinated tools to solve the issues identified. Whereas RN, that we've seen both a lack of interest and also expertise in making a more systematic sense about its education system performance and also outcomes. And what is underpinning the CE's reform efforts here, we also see a committed political leadership and also close interest alignment, whereas RN, we see that like the political disturbance here make it more difficult to get support and pro-reform coalitions. And lastly, as mentioned in the timeline slide, right? So we do see some like copying of the policies from the successful case of Sierra, but we see that it is unlikely to succeed without taking into account the sophisticated set of policy capacity in order to make these reforms work. So I'll just end with some directions of the future researches. So given that this comparison here is mostly utilizing the secondary source of data, so we do hope to conduct interviews with the stakeholders in the future, especially to understand both the interactions within within different dimensions of policy capacity to see if what would be the causal chain within this these dimensions look like, and also the insights shared with the interviewees will also give us a more nuanced account of how reforms experienced on the ground are similar or discrepant from what happened or what we see on paper. And also, given the importance of policy capacity, we would also be interested to explore how it can be furnished within the public organizations. And lastly, so for the systems aspiring to catch up, right, like in the case of RN, it also remains to be seen whether there exists a few critical aspects of capacity that should be prioritized, or how the development of different types of capacity should really be pushed in sync. So yeah, that comes to the end of my presentation, and thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions and the comments.
Thank you very much. Can you please unshare the screen?
I'll do that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Yifei, for your presentation. The floor is open for those who have questions. Is the hand up, but I can't see because
Sonia.
Sonia, well, you can rely on an education person in an education presentation, can't you? Sonia, please.
Hi, Yifei. Thanks very much for your talks. Really interesting stuff. And I look forward to the students hearing about it on our education course as well. So I was just wondering if you maybe would say a bit more about, I was very interested in your your unpacking and conceptualizing of policy capacity and the sort of the table you had with the 3 columns. And I was quite interested by one of the dimensions being the commitment to education and evidence-based policy making. So I suppose I'd like it if you'd say a bit more about how you assess what counts as commitment to evidence-based policy making. So you said something about how sort of the focus on schools rather than adult education was informed by data. But I wonder if you had any other sense in which there was a stronger commitment to education and evidence-based policy making in the CE rather than the RN region. And then also, I also wondered about the involvement of non-state actors and the way that they were kind of, the fact that their contribution was more welcomed and incorporated in CE than in RN. And I'm not even going to try and pronounce the states. But I just wondered about why would that be helpful for policy capacity, and what was the mechanism by which you think that's a useful thing to have? So yeah, those are my questions. Hope you heard.
Yeah, thanks so much for the excellent questions, Sonia. So Timo, do I answer that immediately, or do you get more questions and then I address together?
Well, there is no second hand up at the moment, so please feel free to go straight away.
Yeah. So thanks again, Sonia. So in terms of the first question, in terms of the commitment to education. So I think, well, if I'm allowed to share the screen again, back to the framework here, right? So I think the commitment, appears twice within the framework. One is the commitment or willingness to really put priority, prioritize the education policy and reforms for different kind of development purposes, which we take here as more on the political capacity side. Whereas I think the commitment to especially the evidence-based policy making here, which is treated, as you can see, on the analytical capacity side. So I think, in the end, how or the more explicit or the more direct account of how or to what extent the commitment to evidence-based policy making, I think this is another question that we need to seek more insights by interviewing some of the key policymakers and stakeholders over on the ground. But I think for this paper, what we see as the as an operationalization or the reflection of their evidence-based policy making is really within the very sophisticated and comprehensive different kind of data infrastructure that they have built, in the sense of there, on the one hand, there is more the system level overview and of to monitor the overall performance, but on the other hand, there's also more there's other data collection that more eyes on the local level, such as the classroom level, and also at the school, at the student level, which is more instead of being a very high level or high state, which is really trying to understand the performance within this localized level, and as to see what kind of support can be further rendered there, given the amount of information collected through that. So that is that is the current picture we offer, and we do see the more necessity to understand the commitment from the perspective of the policymakers later on. In terms of the involvement of the non-state actors here, so we see it more as a way of like consulting the multiple stakeholders so as to better align the diverse interest here. So one example in the case of CE is that again it's on the front of improving the solving the illiteracy issue, is that in 2005, I think, yeah, there is this CRS committee for the elimination of school literacy, which is the key actor that pushes for the PIAC program that we see in 2007 as a comprehensive program reform targeting the illiteracy issue. So that particular initiative, it's actually, even though it's, I think, initiated by one of the members of parliament, but essentially it's a partnership effort that involves both the international organizations such as UNICEF, and then I think the Association of Municipal Education Leaders, and also the support from the state and the municipal offices, but I think the local universities and also the teachers unions, and also the education-related NGOs are incorporated in this partnership, in which their contributions are both solicited and also taken on board. And the reason why it is a contrast with the case of RN is that even though RN has some externally funded projects such as by both the World Bank and also like the I think like some other initiatives there as well. But so that was happening, I think, both ones at like 2007 and then later on in 2015 as well. But once the project has finished, I think the project focused more on the financing side, but once the project has finished, there is no further efforts to disseminate the initiatives, and also there's no reflection of this later on within their policy planning documents. So that is like the contrast of involvement of other stakeholders that we observed in the two cases. Yeah. Have I answered the questions? Just to stop sharing.
Yeah, because without sharing, as long as we share, I can't see the rest of the room because the image gets so small. But now I see Lucinda's arm is up. Please, Lucinda.
Thank you. Yeah, that was really interesting, Yifei, and the sort of very stark contrast across all these elements between the two cases. And it had me thinking about your last slide was potentially the crucial one, in that both within these forms of capacity, but also across them, it seemed to me that there's likely to be kind of vicious cycles and virtuous cycles. So, does a commitment to evidence-based lead to collecting the data, or does or proactive engagement with the data, and so there's interrelation where you think, well, one's going to lead to the other, and that will get you on your virtuous cycle or your vicious cycle. And so it seems to me that your last slide had the kind of the crucial questions about what the kind of sequencing was potentially, but also that point about are there sort of critical points that can shift from one cycle to the other. And so I wondered how you were going to be able to do that. So that's a rather big question, but it seems to be that I mean, you said you were going to conduct additional interviews and data collection, but I wondered how you could actually disentangle, what the critical points are and what the sequencing was, and so what your strategy was for that.
Right. Thanks for this question, Lucinda. Yeah, I think it's like really important. Well, given that like it is one of the directions that we plan to pursue in the future, it's really important to think about like how to really answer the questions over there. So I think what the bottom line is that certainly like we cannot rely entirely on the limited secondary resources that we have here. So definitely we will rely on more for more of the insights from the stakeholders, especially the policymakers behind that, to see like well directly like their insights of through their account, like just to walk us through the evolutions of the developments of the like entire set of education reform again. But on the other hand, I think like from our side, or even maybe before hearing their insights, is that I think more needs to be done like with regard to our understanding of the unfolding of their education reform efforts, right? So what we have, which I think is a good starting point, is the timeline that I presented earlier. But then I think like more needs to be understand is like, so we've seen a little bit of a hint there, but more needs to be understand of the connections between one points to the other, right? So what kind of reforms like generated the need of the subsequent reform, or like how does the subsequent reform, either it's addressing a deficit like that is spotted earlier, or it's like building on the momentum from an earlier reform, like to push it even further. So I think having a clearer understanding of the connections of the reform, so that picture would like be goes hand in hand with the insights shared by the policymakers. So combining them together will give us like clearer pictures of both in terms of the sequence and both in terms of reflecting whether there is the critical capacity to prioritize first, or it's really something that like you can't afford to like give up like any dimension at any moment, but needs to be pushed in sync. Yeah, so I think like combining both will it's the direction to go for us to generate more insights over there.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful.
I have a maybe related methodological question. You set out a most different research design, but most similar research design, and then look at emerging divergence. But to find an explanation for that divergence, you need competing theories at the outset, and then have proxy variables for that. What you do is present policy capacity as an explanation, as your starting point, and then you're looking, and then you organize your data, your observations alongside your analytical framework, rather than in terms of an explanatory capacity. So even if you find that policy capacity is different between the two places in terms of explanation, you can't really offer much if you don't have the competing theories that you knock down one by another. So to then establish your capacity is the last man, last woman standing. So here, and then I wonder, looking at the capacity stuff, whether it's not just too much in one, because it covers basically everything in a way. So by covering more or less everything, is it actually useful to explain the difference? So competing accounts in public policy would go like, well, institutionalist explanation in ideational, or you might look at partisanship or policy entrepreneurs, but all these things you somewhat squeeze into the capacity one. So it's like everything is in there. So at the end of the day, you kind of can't be wrong, can you? But then what is added?
Yeah, thanks very much for this comment. So I think, well, in terms of, yeah, I do agree about the importance of like having alternative like series over there. But I think, well, like the way that it is framed within the most similar case design is also like to look at like what are the things that you have controlled for here. So in that case, I mean, even though I didn't frame it as a way of alternative like series explicitly, but I think by looking at the similarities in terms of the level of resources here, right? So basically, like you've seen the similarities in terms of both the resources in general, which is indexed by our GDP per capita, and also the size of government. So essentially, like the picture that you've seen here is that, well, overall, the resource level, both in general and education specific, is relatively similar within the two cases. But on the other hand, for whatever nuances that they generate here, right, it is actually, well, the RN, the worst performing state, that like by level of resource, having more resources, both the economic ones and also in terms of like the number of civil servants available, and also the number of financial investment that they give on students. So in that, so if we follow the line of, well, like implicitly within those high performing education system literature, right? So which is from like a high, from the systems within a high level of socioeconomic development, then the prediction that would be offered by the resource-based kind of series, it would actually, we would actually expect the RN to be performing much better as better as compared with CE, right? But somehow this is not the picture that we're seeing, and the reverse was true, and the reverse was true building on like what is actually a quite similar starting point, in which both states started with a relatively poorer performance as compared with the national average. So this is why, like, in order to explain the divergence of their performance, then I think, well, like this is where the policy capacity framework and also using it to impact the reform experience. So that's the value added here. So, and also like in terms of the second comment that I see here, so, well, basically like building on, well, given that this is the second paper of using policy capacity to explain the education outcomes, so we do see that the explanation that we offer here is well, still like relatively more comprehensive one, but within this comprehensiveness, right, what more needs to be teased out in terms of either the directions towards like the political coalitions or like the policy entrepreneurship. So that kind of like a more detailed like glimpse within those comprehensive dimensions, that is again like the next step to be taken to be taken this research forward.
Thanks for your presentation. I just wanted to comment on alternative reading, maybe, of your results, because I saw that, well, there's a big difference in outcomes between these two states or regions, especially in terms of appropriate reading skills, I think, 50-something versus 30-something. Right. And it seems to me that even though the first case seems to have the policy capacities in place, or at least in comparison to the other one, the outcomes seem really poor as well. I mean, 52%, I think, the kids had the appropriate reading skills, if I'm correct, which doesn't sound very good. And of course, that has to do with the national average, right? So I wanted to ask you, and also maybe to counter or to prevent an over-optimistic reading of the results, what are the limits of political capacity, especially when on the national level things don't seem to work very well, even if there are capacities there? Thank you.
Right. Yeah. So, well, both are excellent questions, Vicente. I think in terms of the first the figure that you pointed out here, right? So how come that despite all the political commitments and well, all the efforts put in there, that well, at least in 2016 literacy rate So the number or the percentage of students having sufficient level of reading skills in CE is 55%. So that is a reminder of like I'll go and check what are the national, like what are the all state figures look like, right? Meaning that, okay, like well, given this absolutely level like low level of the literacy rate here, so how does that really fare within within all states in Brazil, right? So does that mean, okay, despite having like 54% of reading scale or literacy rate, is it like a top performing, or is it just a slightly above the average? So the data is available there, and I'll have a check and like to see the full picture out there. And the second question that I think that he pointed out is, well, the limitations of political capacity, and more specifically, the political willingness of treating the treating education as a priority, right? Which is why, well, like I think this point is related to like really to see whether political capacity is well, either sufficient condition for other capacity to develop, or is it a like necessary condition? So well, like not only drawing on the research here, but also like so the messages from this research is that, well, one, as you can see that one state, the CE, does have like a very strong political capacity, and which might be well, either facilitated or directly inspired the other capacity to be developed as well. But like from my previous research on China and India, right? So like which like that research would cast a doubt on whether it is a sufficient condition for education reforms to be successful, because in that case of like a comparison between Beijing and Delhi, we actually observed both states to have quite strong political commitment into making education as a priority, to really like investing in education reforms like towards a better outcome. But despite the similarly strong political willingness in those two cases, we still observed that whereas in Beijing, the policy instruments for teacher capacity development was more comprehensive, and they are more willing to listen to the voice of the recipient of such support, whereas that wasn't the case in Delhi. So in that case, like that kind of like is a doubtful note on whether it can be a sufficient condition, as well as, like, to put it in your way, I think it highlights the limitation of just like relying on the dimension of political capacity or political willingness. Stop sharing.
Any other or follow-up question? Nothing? If not, well, thank you very much, Yifei, for your presentation and sharing this work in progress with us. Next week, we are back again in a hybrid environment, with the author being online. Chiara Orsini will be joining us from Sheffield. She was very keen to come in person, but became a victim of the school's early calling off of in-person events throughout the entire term. So, and by the time the school changed their policy, sadly, she had already other commitments, so it couldn't come down as she would have loved to do as sort of first order preference. But please still do come in great numbers into the room to get your cake and the savory snack possibly. So next week, Chiara joining us from Sheffield on parental skills and autism, a really great paper again. we will be having. Thank you very much for joining everybody in the room and online, and have a lovely afternoon and rest of the day. Take care and winke winke.